Hey everyone, you're here again with another video for Hebrew in Israel. As you can see, I'm recording from a different side of the room because of the difficulty I've been having with using the camera. It's a lot of work. I'm talking about a Canon camera, the very stereotypical type, and it's been very difficult to edit and focus and so on. So I've just decided to use the camera on the computer that I'm using, and also means that I can use my new microphone here as well, which means you can get a better sound, which I think is a lot more important than the video quality itself. And what I want to talk about today is continuing the subject of the word study, or actually what I said calling demystifying biblical Hebrew. And the subject I want to talk about today is called Qeri and Ketiv. I've been asked by several people to make a video about this, so here I am. Qeri is from the word kara, which is to read. Ketiv is from the root katav, which means to write. The idea is that you can write something but read something different. Where do we see this? If you have a Bible, and I happen to have at least one here next to me, you might open up your Bible and see words on the sides, up here, over there. And when you look in text itself, depending on the type of copy that you have, you will see sometimes words which are without vowel points, or they're isolated somewhere or another in the margin, the bottom of the page, in the page itself in brackets. It doesn't really matter. The point is each printer does something else, but it's the same principle. There are words in the biblical text, when I mean printed biblical text, not the Torah scroll or scrolls of the Dead Sea Scroll and so on, that are based on a problem that the Masoretes had to deal with. Now, the Masoretes, at least the way I understand it, the Masoretes had a lot of different texts in front of them. They weren't working off of just one text. They were working off of many texts. And though the Masoretes had what they called the Masoretic tradition, there were different Masoretes, there were different people teaching, and they were also very well aware of other existing documentation of the biblical text. Therefore, they weren't really working in a vacuum. They were working inside an existing reality that they had to deal with all the time. So when they actually sat down to create what we know as the Masoretic text, which is by most considered to be the text known as the Aleppo Codex, or the Keter Aram Tzuva, and they wanted to produce a text that would be considered to be authoritative. Now, first misconception that exists is that the Masoretes created something new. The answer is no. According to the work done by several researchers, such as Immanuel Tov, that the representation of pre or similar to Masoretic text in the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually very, very high, over 40%, which means it's the majority of the texts. Then we also have other texts that exist, like, for example, Septuagint, similar texts, which is this debate who actually created the Septuagint, but we're not going to go into that now. And you have Samaritan, and then free texts, ones which are not really considered to be anything that represents any specific strain of text that exists. But besides that, together with these pre-Masoretic texts, people slowly develop this more and more. You reach a point where the Masoretes around the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries have to develop an authoritative text, and they have a Babylonian tradition, they have traditions from the land of Israel, they have traditions from Egypt, and they need to sit down and make a decision. Now, in some places, the text is exactly the same from one place to the other, and therefore there's no question. However, there are places where the Masoretes couldn't make a decision. And what they did is they created these margin notes that represent, here's another version of what the text is. And what they wrote into the text itself is a version that's the written, and in the margin they wrote what's supposed to be actually read out. The idea, at least the way I understand it, is that these differences were both placed into the text because the Masoretes could not cancel one in front of the other. They were both considered to be correct. Now, there are different kinds of changes that happen, so I'm going to try at least list the most important ones. One change that can happen is a spelling change. For example, Vav and Yud are considered to be consonants that interchange. Therefore, when they interchange, and I apologize because my camera is up there, but I'm actually looking directly at the screen, the interchanging Vav and Yud is something to do with historical roots. So sometimes, historically speaking, they would have a vav originally, but then in time it turned into a yud. But because in certain texts they maintained the older spelling, then the spelling will be with a vav, and they couldn't cancel that out. And there's actually a book about the spelling, especially the Qere and Ketiv situation, written by someone called Maimon, I think by Magnus Publications. And he actually goes over all of this, and he demonstrates that many of the changes are actually Vav Yud changes, which are more to do with historical spelling than anything else. So we have things like that. So it's not really a change in the word, it's just a change in the spelling. Then we can even have cases of dialects. For example, there are places where we see the appearance of different dialects in the biblical text, like for example, northern dialects versus southern dialects, where the spelling could be affected by the way people actually spoke. So for example, there's the famous at versus ati, which is the second feminine singular demonstrative of you. But in the north, instead of saying at, they said ati, or something like that, with an ending. And we see that the Masoretes preserved this. So it's very interesting to see that Masoretes, many, many years after these texts were actually written, still maintained spelling that presents a pronunciation and a spelling that hasn't been in existence for a very, very long time. So I find that to be very, very intriguing. Another change that can happen is what we can call inappropriate words. Inappropriate words are words that became obsolete in the vernacular because people consider them to be vulgar. A few interesting examples is the situation of the word shagal. Shagal seems to be a harsh word that has to do with sexual relations. And it's interesting, in Deuteronomy, the text says shagal. You have shin gimel lamed, but in the reading, it says shachav, as if to talk about laying. Shachav shin kaf bet has to do with to lay and not with the sexual act. Has to do probably with the issue of reading this text out in public and people hearing words which, you don't use in the public domain, a public forum. It's like, certain taboos of not saying certain words on television or not using certain languages in certain types of programs and so on. So we have that. Or another example is the case of the plague that hit the Philistines when they took the ark in the book of Samuel. The text uses the word ophalim, but in the margin we have the word cholim. Cholim are hemorrhoids. Ophalim seem to be something else. As a side note, one of the questions that comes up is, how did the Philistines depict hemorrhoids? The answer is, it wasn't hemorrhoids. One of the interesting things about the Philistines, which also resembles the Romans, is the fact that they specifically had a lot of worship of fertility, and therefore it's possible that the ophalim was more something that attacked their reproductive organs and not their rear ends. And therefore what they sent was actually phalluses, and basically gold phalluses, which are not unknown in the archaeology of the Philistines, and therefore the word, the reference to the reproductive organ, was considered to be so rude to say in public that you didn't, and therefore the word was replaced. One of the questions that's asked about this is, when did this begin? And the answer is, we don't know. However, one of the suggestions that I've heard, and I've heard this multiple times, is that even in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah it began. Why Ezra and Nehemiah? Ezra and Nehemiah were the people who produced the idea of reading the biblical text out in public. One of the theories, I think, might have been Menachem Haran, was that in the temple, you might have walked into the temple and there were texts written on tablets in different places on the temple that people could see the law. This was a very common thing. We even see this amongst the Greeks and the Romans, what's referred to as the epistolar. The word apostle, by the way, comes from the term epistolaros or epistolar, which means a declaration, a proclamation out loud, which usually meant that you actually wrote on a tablet the decree by the king. So this was very common. However, we don't really know of public readings except for what the Torah says about once at the end of every 7 years, at the end of the year Shemitah, the king reads out parts of the Torah, maybe the entire Torah. And a few maybe acts of reciting verses out loud and so on. But we don't hear about a reading of the entire Torah in front of everyone. So the theory is that because Ezra and Nehemiah were the ones who introduced this idea of reading the Torah in public as a form of worship as well, which is also, again, considered to be a relatively new idea to the Second Temple period, they introduced this issue of changing this idea of changing certain words, because in the public, you've got children there are words you don't really say. Prior to this, the language, it was more acceptable to say certain things, and then in time it changed. Some people even say maybe Ezra and Nehemiah were a bit of, I wouldn't say reformist, but slightly too strict. So some people would present it that way. It's a subject I've been studying the past couple of months, very intriguing subject, which I will share about. But what's most important to point out here is that it is possible that this is something much, much earlier than what we think. One of the things that vexes me a lot, regardless of the fact that I'm Jewish, one of the things that vexes me a lot as a scholar, as a researcher, as an historian, and especially a historian of biblical times, is the fact that people try to pin things on sages, rabbis, people living hundreds of years after the account, and say, oh, they did this, because they're trying to say, oh, we're going to be like the Bible, but we're going to ignore the fact that the Bible is something which is most definitely Jewish. The idea of graphomania, writing a lot of books, is something that appears more in the Second Temple period, not in the First Temple. So though there might have been books and stories and so on, the idea of putting things into a text and saying, look, this is our text now, was something more of the Second Temple, more of the sages of the Second Temple, which obviously the people who inherited them were the Pharisees, and then after that the Jewish sages and so on. So it's just, there's a lot of historical inaccuracy in certain claims that people make. In any case, that's a simplified version of what Qere and Ketiv is. You can actually pick up a Hebrew Bible and see these things for yourself. If you're adequate in biblical Hebrew, or at least can read a little bit, you'll notice the differences. You can also open up a dictionary, look into this, and actually learn by yourself. But this is the basic introduction idea of what a Qere and Ketiv situation is. So I hope you enjoyed this. You are more than welcome to comment. Visit me on my Facebook page, Hebrew in Israel. You can also email me at hebrewinisrael@gmail.com. Also, you can visit my website, hebrewinisrael.wix.com. Yes, I know the Wix is a little annoying, but that's the one I'm using at the moment. And I want to thank you again for joining me for another video. Thank you.